All right. So this is awesome. And I'm loving that again, the enthusiasm. And I want to unpack now a little bit more again in this kind of multilateral framework piece. Let's talk about COP. But if you'll indulge me, I want to talk about the stock take that's going on effectively this year in Dubai. First, I want to get your opinion of where we're at. So can you unpack that for me? And then I've got a bunch of other questions for you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so only, I think, late September is when the Stocktake press release came out. It was nothing we weren't expecting to hear. But I got to say, it took me a minute. And I was like, let me retreat as I sulk at the state of the world today before I come back and talk about how do we, move forward on this. It's not great. I think, so back in Glasgow, that's when the technical dialogue on the stocktake actually started. And I was in that meeting where where countries were like officially starting the stocktake. We do it until 2023, after which we start revising our NDCs, we get policy recommendations, and by 25, we come up with a new NDC. And that's what the purpose of the stocktake is, to help countries realize if they're moving on the right pathway and whether they can actually up their ambition and how much they have to up their ambition by. So this is really like a report card of the world, and it sees across the board.
Sees across the board. No, but that's
up and
not,
down a bit.
That's not facetious. That's actually a very good assessment of it. To me, I completely agree with you. And I've got some views in terms of why maybe the ambition isn't where it ought to be. Because when I look at it from a mathematical and even just a charting perspective, visually, emissions have been going up and up and up. Then NDCs are made and they're like charting in this trajectory. Draw the line down. It's not ambitious enough and it won't get us under the targets with regards to 1.5 nor 2 degree scenario. So that needs to increase in ambition and be much more aggressive.
And I think
how does that happen? So they get a C now, and then what's going to happen? Where's the stick in this?
Yeah, and there is. I think there's two things that the way policymakers, it seems to me, like having seen the June sessions and having seen G20 also go on and given their declaration, even the African Climate Summit. So there's two things I think. One is the 2 degree scenario, where we are still harping on about cut down fossil fuel emissions, triple renewable energy. These are all targets that are aligned to the 2 degree scenario. 1.5, I think we are already in that reality. And, not everybody will agree, and that's fine, but we are already in the overshoot scenario.
I completely agree.
And we are not going to be able to do it by just making policy decisions. We are talking about aggressive technological solutions. There's the Climate Overshoot Commission recently came out with a report where they talked about, solar geoengineering, talking about solar radiation. I mean, so these conversations have come on top if you're talking about 1.5 still. So one thing we've recognized is, and this is a quote from James Bond personally, it's a quote I go back to a lot: age is not a sign of efficiency and youth is not a sign of innovation. And what we are talking about is we are come at a point where efficiency and innovation cannot be at contrast with each other. System transformation and innovation cannot come at the cost of each other. They have to start joining hands. And so these two voices that have sort of sat at the other end, there's a group saying technology is not the silver bullet, and then technology is saying we don't need to change the capital markets. They can't afford to be that separated. And so I think one thing we have recognized from the Global Stocktake is we have to start putting all in. We can't afford to continue down certain pathways. And so I think
be selective, one over the other.
One over the other. We have to start making trade-off decisions quicker, and we have to start getting bold in our decision making. And I think that's not, political will plays a huge part, but what is happening is we have to err on the side of caution. We have to start taking those risks. And that's very obvious to me at this point. I think we're also seeing global leaders changing their position around this, and we're hoping that actually is done in an accelerated format.
Can I summarize that?
Go for it.
With a movie quote.
Okay, go on. Yeah.
Do everything, everywhere, all at once.
There you go.
Right? Because, and that's a real point of kind of consternation right now, certainly in carbon markets, right? So I'll talk my own book.
Yeah.
There's this tribalism essentially that happens where people are super passionate about their little niche, and in order to feel vindicated and justified, like the righteousness aspect, is they'll denigrate another viable solution.
Yeah.
And what you realize over time in the multilateral engagement piece is that you can do both things.
Yeah.
And essentially, if they're both targeting the same outcome, why can't they be accretive? Why can't we do that and this?
Yeah.
What does it have to be this or that?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to me. It's kind of reductive.
Right.
And ultimately it plays into the inaction paradigm where, well, it's not perfect, tools down, and it's just like the perfect being the enemy of the good. And I just don't think that that's constructive. And like you said, urgency, ratchet it up to 10. Let's go. Let's look at innovation. Let's look at the efficiency piece on the execution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great summary. And especially coming to carbon markets, something which, which people, especially, so I'm with an NGO and the NGO sector specifically has trouble seeing the benefit or being able to criticize carbon markets in a balance.
Yeah, I think criticism is welcome.
Yeah.
Quite frankly. And it should be encouraged, but it ought to be constructive. And perhaps this is also another reason why we get along so well. We had this conversation at the Carbon Markets Institute event about a couple of months back.
Yeah.
And obviously there's this perception that NGO and private sectors, especially market proponents, ought to be combative. They shouldn't. We're working together for the same outcome. And why do they need to be divergent? I think that markets offer certain outcomes and benefits, pricing externalities, all this cool rational economic theory kind of arguments, and there's also a greed quotient, right, of engaging capital, etc.
Yeah.
But you talked about human rights being included under the Article 6 piece.
Right.
Carbon Markets has done a really great job, I think, not only of just pricing carbon emissions, but also including sustainable development goals.
And that trend is good, and it's getting better.
Great.
I agree.
And I think it's an example of how two things can be done at the same time. So I don't think combativeness is actually at all helpful.
I think one thing I struggle with here, and maybe this is me reflecting on the news I read, which is a critical part of the job if you're in this sector. This is changing too rapidly to be not, you can't get complacent. You got to keep yourself updated.
Oh, no, it's not boring, that's for sure.
And so I think, for example, the windfall gains of fossil fuel companies in the past 2 years have raised serious questions about their intentions. And speaking of Christina Figueres, who is somebody that I personally look up to, in her speech right after Paris Agreement, she said, I have fossil fuel companies coming to me, asking me how they can transform, and that's a sign of good. And 6 months earlier from today, she wrote an op-ed about how she's kind of completely given up on fossil companies. She thinks they're actually standing in the way. And you see leaders kind of changing their opinions constantly, and you see good enough reason.
But it's a human condition. It's like you're optimistic, like you said, there's rational optimism.
Yeah.
There's exuberant optimism. And ultimately there's the realists and the pragmatists, and then on the other side of the spectrum, the pessimists, right? I'm kind of like, I'm leaning towards the optimists, but also in the pragmatist and the realist kind of camp around what happens. And you become jaded with age. And that's, I think, another reason why encouraging youth is so essential, because we need to keep drawing from that fountain effectively to have that momentum.
You're less bogged down in the convention and
there's
the
that
processes.
And also just again, you just run out of steam. It's a marathon and not a sprint, and you just kind of, you get a bit jaded. And it's true to a certain extent in terms of, I've seen it both sides. There's an entrenched view because they're essentially, they have a P&L incentive and a balance sheet incentive, disincentive as well. They have a liability effectively by admitting that they knew about climate change and their impacts around it, but essentially not or like dragging their feet around the transformation. And then for shareholders, there's essentially a stranded assets risk. And so I can understand why there's pushback. But effectively, again, two opposing forces kind of create inaction. And it's kind of like a judo thing or a vector thing. If you're a maths nerd like me, you can kind of change the vector, and then you can actually get forward momentum. So where does a consensus build? And that's where it comes back to.
And I feel, but what I feel is the looming reality over all of this, and this is not to kind of cancel out anything you said, because I do agree there is that convergence which sits at the because end of the day you need the decision to get there.
Sure.
But is that we have a carbon budget and we have a time that we're running against, and that is very hard to ignore.
No doubt.
That's extremely hard to ignore when you're talking about quarterly windfall gains, and when you're talking about absolute emissions, you're talking about energy demand rise. Those
talk about planetary boundaries, and six out of nine are
talk
now
about biodiversity, nature,
it's alarming, no question about it.
It is, and I think it's, I say this to a lot of young people who say, "What can I do?" That's not an unheard question, and they are, in the looming crisis of like larger systemic changes, what can I as a person do? And as supportive as I want to be, I have to say that this is what you can do. but these are the things that also affect the course of the world. So don't not eating eating dairy or beef is not going to, you're not solely responsible for the destruction of the world. So kind of distancing yourself a little bit from this larger decision making process and like kind of not going into anxiety, but actually using that energy to be able to make the right decisions and influence it in whatever circle you do. You do art, you can have an influence there.
Right.
You do music, there's an avenue for for expressing certain opinions and voices, creating the larger momentum. So I always find it like to distance yourself from the larger crises and systemic transformation is also an important part of not paralyzing yourself with inaction and actually still doing what you can. Yeah.
Awesome. What a wonderful perspective. Thanks about that. That's great.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to have a quick drink.
Yeah. Me too. I've been drinking way slower than you have.
No, it's okay. It's fine.